May 9th. Rain. Stared out the window all day. Peaceful here. Nothing to do. Still not allowed to go outside. May 10th. Still raining. Talked with the doctor a little. Would they have saved me if I didn't have a family to feed? I know I'm pathetic. Weak. Not everyone could be strong. May 11th. Rain again. Meds made me feel sick today. I'm only better when I'm drugged. Then who am I anyway? May 12th. Rain as usual. I don't want to cause any more trouble for anyone, but I'm a bother either way. Can it really be such a sin to run away instead of fight?
I don't think any written note in a video game has ever stuck with me quite as much as the rooftop journal from Silent Hill 2. There's just something so raw about reading a note from someone this broken, with enough details in the environment for you to put two and two together about the conclusion the author came to. Silent Hill 2 is a grim game. This sounds pretty obvious. It's a mature rated horror game. But even still, now 20 years after its first release, it's genuinely surprising the direction Silent Hill 2 was allowed to take for an early 2000s video game. Let's be real though, if you're watching this, you probably already know that. Silent Hill 2 might be the mecca of over-examined, over-analyzed, and over-debated video games. To the point where I was genuinely arguing with myself how I could even approach this video with anything unique to add. There's countless essays, articles, threads, and videos where fans of the game argue for their stance on the symbolism, character motivations, and break down Silent Hill 2 piece by piece to deconstruct it all. Being blunt, trying to come up with a similar video to the Silent Hill 1 20th anniversary analysis I did a couple years back was daunting, and failing for weeks on end to come up with any kind of script worth reading ate at me. Hell, for the finished video, I'm not even confident this is a script worth reading. After agonizing over it, I just sort of figured that since trying to give a hard literary analysis of Silent Hill 2 was a path very well traveled, I'd not even try to compete. Only way I was gonna be able to write this was to be honest and to be personal. So if you came here looking for a Silent Hill explained or a how to beat Silent Hill type of video, then you're gonna be let down. No, what I'm doing is far more pretentious and up my own ass. Explain what Silent Hill 2 means to me. And I'll be honest, it means a lot. I was an edgy piece of shit in my youth, and frankly, I still am in a lot of ways. And Silent Hill 2 was one of the pieces of media around that period that really defined me, as stupid as that sounds reading it out loud. So there's not many ways I could take this project other than giving my own personal touch to it. For my money, the real defining line that sums up what Silent Hill 2 is about comes from that rooftop notebook. Can it really be such a sin to run away instead of fight? This is the idea that the game centers itself around. The most prominent topics that Silent Hill 2 broaches across the arcs of the core three cast members, being James, Angela, and Eddie, are denial to yourself and others, running from your past, and your reaction when forced to confront it. While all three have their own unique spins on these ideas, and individual circumstances and hang-ups, it's mutual for them all. The notes even follow this line of thought. They start off with things such as the Walter Sullivan newspaper article, which details a brutal murder he committed yet vocally denies being responsible for. Once you get to Brookhaven Hospital, things get a bit more murky with the back-to-back examples of the aforementioned rooftop journal, as well as the doctor's personal memo that details a patient he's treating who presumably has schizophrenia. The doctor argues with himself about forcing the patient into his treatment plan, stating how he seems happy in the world of delusions he's built for himself. Even if they force him into reality, his physical situation really wouldn't change for the better. From these to even later notes with some truly brutal lines like, "I wasn't looking for the truth, I was looking for tranquility," Silent Hill 2 sets up its core thematic conflict. What sets this game apart from other stories that are about facing your past actions, including its two most notable influences, is how Silent Hill 2 tries to give a devil's advocate argument in favor of running away from your past, and doesn't bash the audience over the head with what conclusion they should come to. What if someone isn't ready to tackle certain aspects of themselves, and forcing the issue just makes it worse? What if, like the patient in the doctor's note, the reality you're forcing someone into wouldn't tangibly improve their quality of life? It's an interesting side of the argument. However, when talking about what Silent Hill 2 means to me, I do think the game provides a fairly definitive answer to this. Before we explore it though, we do have to talk about the real core of Silent Hill 2's storytelling, the central cast of characters. Silent Hill 2 is most often seen as the best entry in the series, and I think the aspect that keeps people more invested in 2 than the others is how the game explores its ideas primarily through 3 very flawed but all too relatable people. While the actual cast is larger, Silent Hill 2's primary focus is set on exploring James, Angela, and Eddie. This is what set the game apart, because this core trio are unlike the kinds of characters you would see populating video game stories at the time. Put simply, these people are weird and kinda fucked up. However, they're weird and kinda fucked up in ways that are more likely to resonate with the audience. Frankly, it can be a bit uncomfortable for me at times to admit that I can see more of myself in these people than I'd care to admit. All 3 roughly follow the same arc, with their specific details and reactions to it defining their personality, and reinforcing the game's take-home message. They begin their arc coming to Silent Hill having fled something they've done in their past. James killing his terminally ill wife essentially at the last minute before the disease took her anyway, Angela killing her father presumably in self-defense, though some old-fashioned revenge had to be a motive as well, and Eddie attempting to kill someone who may have bullied him at some point, but didn't follow through with it. The town gave them some sort of way out, calling them there, as James put it, and every step of the way it torments them with their deepest insecurities and buried truths. We see James's experience from beginning to end, brief bits of Angela's with a grotesque abstract daddy boss encounter, and can infer Eddie is going through the same thing. All 3 of their arcs conclude with them confronting their past actions head-on and whether or not they crumble under them. Eddie and Angela both self-destruct in ways that are fitting of their characters, and James's fate depends on the ending the player receives. While James is very clearly the real focus of the story and ideas, the arcs of Angela and Eddie are both still important for the themes Silent Hill 2 tries to get across. Angela and Eddie are fairly decent characters to look at together, considering they're both polar opposite extremes of how to react when faced with the trauma, ugly truths, and mindfuckery Silent Hill enjoys dishing out to people. When confronted with their past mistakes, Angela mostly internalizes it, putting the blame for her entire situation onto herself, ignoring the context of her fucked up family life that led to her rash solution. On the flip side, we have Eddie, who mostly externalizes it, pushing the blame for what he's done on pretty much anyone looking at him funny. While they are extremes in the end, it's worth noting a bit more nuance in their responses. After all, we see moments of the usually frightened and meek Angela getting aggressive with James. We also see moments where Eddie reflects on his own part in his current situation. I guess the point I'm trying to get at is that even with 2 characters that end up being extreme ends of how to respond to facing yourself, they're not just played as straight caricatures. They have moments of anger and self-doubt respectively, which goes a long way to showing that their responses are all too human. Because, really, I think Silent Hill 2 does come down on whether confronting your past and facing the truth is always for the best. Through the arcs of the core cast members, the game is saying yes. While it acknowledges the fact that it isn't going to be easy, and in fact it's going to be a ride through hell in some extreme circumstances, ultimately it's the right thing to do. Regardless of the pain, facing it, acknowledging it, and accepting it allows you to take some control over your life and truly embrace yourself for who you are. Eddie doesn't by the end of his arc, and while Angela tries to, she does so in an unhealthy manner that places the blame for her circumstances on herself. They meet fates fitting of how they ultimately saw things. Angela blamed herself for things out of her control, and in the end, it's implied she does herself in. Eddie lashed out at the vague idea of they and them being against him, and gets killed by James in self-defense. Both failed to resolve their pasts, and both succumbed to their worst impulses. Impulses, to some degree, I'm sure everyone has. Frankly, I think a lot of people will see themselves in both Angela and Eddie to varying degrees. Being a bit too open again, it's honestly a bit uncomfortable to admit how similar I get to Eddie at my worst moments, as my drunk comment history on random videos would more than likely show. It really is all too easy to fall into a trap of despising yourself down to your core and assuming everyone you meet or interact with feels the exact same way about you as you do yourself, like they're making fun of you with their eyes. While Eddie claims to have been bullied, which on paper would give him some justification, however juvenile and flimsy, keep in mind Eddie is the only source of information on that. He's far from a reliable witness, and as we'll see at the end, he even projected his own insecurities onto James, assuming he was laughing at him the whole time. Thing is, and while this might be just a bit of projecting myself onto the character, I admit, I think Eddie knows this too. His brief conversation with Laura gives a much more self-doubting, pitiful look at the character. And one detail I noticed was how, when he claims that killing someone isn't a big deal, or if that anyone makes fun of him from now on, he'll kill him, he points the gun at his own head. Maybe a sign that deep down he knows the real source of all his self-loathing, but is too far gone to admit it openly. By that same token, Angela as well is sadly relatable in a lot of ways. I've never been in a position like she has, thank God, but when life inevitably throws you through the ringer, as it always will, that same impulse to give in and admit defeat is there. Probably projecting again, but it can be hard to accept random misfortune and being victimized as just that, random or just not your fault. And if there's no one to blame, or if you can't bring yourself to blame those actually responsible, there's always the person in the mirror you can direct all of your pain and rage towards. And after all, it's what you deserve, and it's easier just to run. However, Eddie and Angela aren't the true focus of Silent Hill 2's narrative. The eye's in for the audience, and the figure who really gives the story its full weight is James Sunderland. Complicated, conflicted individual who can take paths similar to the first two or break free from the prison of his own making depending on the actions made during the game. Just a little aside, but one reading of Silent Hill 2 that bothers me is the idea that James Sunderland has no set personality, and who he is gets filled in at the end by the player's input and actions. This to me was always totally absurd. First off, the idea that one aspect of the man's personality taking precedent in one of the endings completely defines his entire being retroactively is a very simplistic way of looking at who people are. Human motivation is a complicated thing, and the game goes out of its way to show the conflicted reasons James had to kill Mary. So boiling it down to something so bland and cookie-cutter misses a lot of what makes James such a compelling protagonist. But why is James such a compelling lead? Well, in a lot of ways, it's because of how unorthodox he is as the main character in a video game, especially at the time. To start with, James Sunderland is no hero, no gunslinging badass, and he's not even particularly charismatic. James is kind of a wimp, honestly. He's quiet and shy, apologizing habitually to others for no real reason. He's meek and generally averse to conflict, just sitting there and taking abuse from others on some occasions without any fuss. He's also pretty damn awkward, and very clearly inhibited in his responses to things. James, to be blunt, is a neurotic mess. And in a lot of ways, all of this is what I think endeared him to a lot of players. Simply put, James being such a reserved oddball made him feel a lot more real and human, even in just the broad strokes. We all know someone like James, and hell, maybe even you yourself are like the guy. This is why the slow drip of details that lead to the final reveal of what he's done is so effective. James is just a flawed but everyday person, and the drop that he killed his already terminally ill wife, and worse yet, might have done so out of spite more than anything, hits harder because of that relatability. Of all the reasons I think you could never do a proper remake of Silent Hill 2 in this day and age, this fundamental aspect of the story told is probably the big one. In a lot of ways, Silent Hill 2 is asking you to try to understand and sympathize with someone who's committed a heinous crime, without chucking some half-assed attempts to make it morally gray, as is the case with most video game narratives. I love how little information the game gives us into the life of James and Mary. We get little details given by James, a less than reliable source, the brutal conversation between the two replayed right before the very end, and the absolutely heartbreaking final letter from Mary herself. That's essentially it, and the game doesn't talk down to the audience by spelling out how you should read their relationship and the end it came to. It's also this aspect that makes me hate the multiple choice mode of reading of James as a character, as the game goes out of its way to try and show how conflicted he is towards his wife and their situation, even after the murder itself. Needless to say, the game hammers in how torn up over her death James is, and from optional small examination prompts, we can see his nostalgia for the days of old with Mary, as well as lamenting the disease which took her. Hell, the very first line of dialogue we hear James say in-game is Mary. James loved his wife, and the months, if not years, of seeing her suffer eventually broke him. It's like he says in the end, he just couldn't watch it anymore. This is, however, a far too simplistic view on its own. Immediately after this, James also says that the truth is, he hated Mary and wanted her gone. There's a fair bit of contextual details in favor of this as well. Characters comment how he never really loved Mary, with one of them literally being this belittling caricature of Mary herself. Speaking of Maria, the scene between the two of them in the labyrinth is the best depiction of one of Silent Hill 2's most common pieces of symbolism: metal bars and prison cell imagery. All throughout the game, we're given metal grates and bars placed where they logically shouldn't be. A large portion of the game's runtime is spent in a prison, and then we have the labyrinth scene itself. The shot framing here is some masterful shit, man, with the exits to both sides out of focus or out of frame for it. Only the two-way cage with James and Maria on opposite end being on the center stage. Which one is supposed to be imprisoned? Or is it both of them, trapped together, at least as James saw it? Finally, as Mary's true letter to James reads, she was essentially on death's door when she would have gone home from the hospital for the last time. You know, the homestay where James made the final call, so to speak. If he truly just wanted her to stop suffering, why would he wait until the 11th hour to do so? We could go back and forth arguing for both sides all day. But the point I'm trying to get at is that I'd argue having all these seemingly contradicting motivations was intentional on the developer's part. It's not to make James some sort of blank slate protagonist you fill in the gaps for either. Fact of the matter is, all of these aforementioned aspects of James are true. The James who loved his wife, who hated her, who was timid and weak, yet also the one who committed something vile he could never take back. All of this and more makes up who James Sunderland is, because he's a man. Just as flawed, complicated, and contradicting as any other. Capable of love, hate, good, and bad. And while he may try to repress and ignore that bad in him, the harder he runs, the stronger it gets, until eventually, it's staring him right in the face. Pyramid Head is a character I've always been a bit conflicted on. While the game does give a very definitive answer for who he is and his role in the narrative, I've always seen him as playing a dual role of sorts. Yes, he's the tormentor and guide to James, meant to punish him for his guilt over killing Mary, at the same time guiding him to fully facing the truth. This much is obvious, but in my opinion, there's a bit more to the character. See, the James we see all throughout the game is the face that he wants to show everyone, or what he wants to be after the incident. Basically, a harmless and ineffectual goober who could never hurt a fly. The thing is, though, the incident in question proves that isn't the case. That James isn't harmless and could do a lot more than just hurt someone. And this, in my opinion, is Pyramid Head's second role. Bit of an aside, but let's talk about the original Silent Hill 2 story pitch. Going off of memory, so correct me if I'm wrong, but in the original plot outline, James and Mary are both supposed to have split personalities of sorts. Mary was to have one named Maria, and James was going to have one named Joseph. The naming convention here is a bit morbid, with Mary coming from Mary Kelly, the fifth and believed to be final victim of Jack the Ripper, and her boyfriend Joseph Barnett, believed to be the one who killed her, and who may have been Jack the Ripper himself. Make of this what you will, but it's worth noting Maria was kept in the final version of Silent Hill 2, while Joseph is nowhere to be seen. However, I don't think that aspect was taken out entirely. Instead, I think the whole Joseph personality just over time morphed into Pyramid Head. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is some split personality situation, because honestly, that's one of the laziest things you can do in something labeled psychological horror. What Pyramid Head is, though, is all of the aspects of James that James himself wants to bury down and bottle up. Whereas James is shy, wimpy, neurotic, and inhibited, Pyramid Head is strong, stoic, animalistic, and aggressive. He takes what he wants, does what he pleases, and acts seemingly without thinking. He's the aspects of himself that James wants to pretend aren't there, but exaggerated to ludicrous degrees. James killed Mary, now Pyramid Head is going to kill Maria multiple times and make him watch. James is sexually frustrated, Pyramid Head is going to dry hump the sexually suggestive monsters to death in front of him. James collects a knife from Angela, Pyramid Head afterwards has the great knife, mirrored later with the pipe and the spear. I could go on, but I think the point is clear. Pyramid Head is to James what Maria is to Mary. And in the end, notice how James never actually defeats Pyramid Head. In their final confrontation, James acknowledges why he needed this creature, and decides now is the time to put him down and be done with it. By accepting what he's done, and at the same time accepting these aspects of himself, both Pyramid Heads kill themselves. Their purpose complete, and their repressed aspects brought back to the surface. It's only by accepting what Pyramid Head represents in himself that James can move on, which leads to the ultimate message of Silent Hill 2. Finally, we loop back around to the question which started this video. Can it really be such a sin to run instead of fight? As we went over, while the game doesn't outright come down and say this, by the very end there's too much in-game evidence to suggest that the core message of Silent Hill 2, in my opinion, is that it's always best to fight. Being blunt, Silent Hill 2 is a story about people who have fucked up and fucked up bad. So with a story like this, what's the most fitting possible conclusion? While this might be a bit of a contrarian move on my part, in my opinion, only one ending works as a satisfactory finale to the ideas that Silent Hill 2 is exploring. It's Leave, the ending where James gets one last meeting with his wife, who tells him to go on and live. While In Water, the fan favorite ending, might admittedly have more foreshadowing pointing towards it, I've always hated how nihilistic it felt. It seems too close to the kind of throw your hands up and just say fuck it conclusions that Angela and Eddie came to. Their character arcs were there, in my opinion, to show how this sort of self-destruction wasn't a way to truly atone or move on. So the idea that in the end James comes to the conclusion that without Mary he has nothing to live for felt like the bad end. Bad end in the sense that it was directly opposed to Silent Hill 2's core message. While it's no doubt a grim, melancholic experience, at its core Silent Hill 2 offers a message of hope. It's not too late to turn back from whatever path you've gone down, and your mistakes, fuck-ups, or sins, I guess, aren't stopping you from salvaging things. You can't always fix what you've done, but it's always possible to try and make some peace with yourself. Even at the end, this was Mary's dying wish for James. For him to go on and live his life, to do what was best for him at that point. More than anything, it's this last light of hope that an otherwise morbid story like Silent Hill 2 gives you that I think made it resonate with so many people. At least it's why it resonates with me. I've fucked up a lot throughout my life. Thankfully not even close to the degree of the game's cast, but in a lot of my lower moments, I'll find myself throwing my hands up in the air and be about ready to just say fuck it. Usually reflecting on how far I've rolled downhill and wondering, can I even fix this? Is it even possible to come back at this point? And that's what Silent Hill 2 really means to me, because with the Leave ending in mind, the answer to those questions and others like it is yes. It's not going to be easy, and depending on how far you've gone, the road back can be hellish. But there is a road back. To live in delusion like the Maria or Rebirth endings, or take some dramatic final act of self-destruction like the In Water ending, solves nothing. However you fucked up, by facing it head on and finding some constructive way to make amends, you can carry on and find peace. The heart of Silent Hill 2 is forgiveness, and sometimes that's an idea I need to